34 na legislatura ng Guam is called to order. Mr. Majority Leader, you are recognized.
Mr. Speaker, notwithstanding the House rules, I move to adopt the session agenda for July 30th, 2018.
On the motion to adopt the session agenda for July 30th, any objections? Hearing none.
Mr. Speaker, notwithstanding the House rules, I move to waive session agenda items 2 through 6.
On the motion to waive session agenda items 2 through 6, hearing no objections. Clerk, please take the roll.
Senator Atta, Senator Uggan, Senator Castro, Speaker Cruz, Senator Espaldon, Senator Esteves, Senator Lee, Senator Morrison, Senator Muñoz, Senator Nelson, Senator Rodriguez, Senator San Augustine, Senator San Nicolas, Vice Speaker Terlahi, Senator Torres. Mr. Speaker, there is a quorum.
Mr. Majority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, notwithstanding the House rules, I move to waive session agenda items 8 through 13.
On that motion, any objection? Hearing none. All members are present. There is no need to excuse any members. We are now in the second reading file.
So we are now in motions?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so Mr. Speaker, I move to resolve into the Committee of the Whole for the purposes of deliberating and addressing Bill 323-34 COR as amended by the Committee on Appropriations and Adjudication and further substituted on the floor by the author, and for the chairman of the Committee on Appropriations and Adjudication to chair the Committee of the Whole and invite the appropriate panel guests.
Is there any objection to that motion? Hearing none, we are resolved. Oh, wait.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker. Are we going into recess?
Yeah, we're resolved into the Committee of the Whole at this point.
Roger.
We're in short recess. for having endured with me this last 8 months. Many of us did not plan on the Tax Act going through in Washington, D.C., and the quick implementation of it, and as a consequence, its effect on our budget. That resulted in a very tumultuous very start of the year. I want to thank all of you for having gone through it with me and for suffering all my dear colleague letters and all the many sessions that we've had to have to try to address the shortfall. And now we come to this, the budget for this upcoming year. At this point, I want to acknowledge and thank my very capable Office of Finance and Budget staff that has worked through all of this with us. When the Tax Cut and Jobs Act was passed, there was some question as to how much we were really going to lose. There were some initial estimates, and the OFB staff very capably went through. They calculated, they called, they cajoled friends to give them inside information as to how much their withholding was actually going down. And so consequently, we were able to finally come to the agreement with the administration that the loss could be about $67 million for the year. I understand that, except for some anomalies, that some large tax payments that were made because of the some sales that were made last year in the corporate tax and the amnesty, we were pretty on point. And that loss was realized. Thankfully, the amnesty and the willingness of the legislature to pass the 1% increase in the BPT has helped us stabilize. And so I want to thank all of you for all that assistance. As budget chair, I've tried to be as transparent as possible. I want to thank those of you that participated over this last year. We had 5 SES meetings, and many of you who weren't SES members sat through those, and I think found them to be very informative and educational as it relates to government operations and government finances. So I thank all of you for your participation in that and the questions that you raised during that period. This year, though I had to kick and pull, I was able to get hearings on nearly all the government agencies. All those hearings were conducted. Many of you participated. Many of you who are not on the committee participated, and you heard the testimony that was given. All the testimony that was provided by all of these agencies was scanned and placed on our legislative website, on our OFB website. All of the hearings were on YouTube. So everybody who missed it during the day could watch it at night, could watch it in weekends. Some of us that were away could watch it while we were away. And so I want to congratulate the MIS staff also and the legislative staff for this new live streaming that has really kept the public informed of what was happening. The intention of having all those public hearings was to have the community realize what each of the departments was doing. And some of the budgets that they were presenting that were just, some were ludicrous. I mean, to not have provided for food contracts and for certain other things, it was imperative that we had to add some of those things back in. But in order for them to meet their caps, they were doing that, and they were coming in like good soldiers. And many of us were asking them questions, well, how about this? And I want to thank all of you for your interest in the departments and your willingness to ask them all those questions. Most recently, you suffered 3 of my dear colleague letters. My one talking about the budget shortfall and the revenue shortfall. And shortly, I'm going to ask OFB to go through that just to walk us through. Not necessarily for all of you, because I think all of you have understood it. But I still hear people out there saying that it's not real. And I want OFB to walk through that so that the public at large can see in color, as we would say in my day and age, in Technicolor, the fact that this is real. I proposed initially 2 budget bills. One I called and please forgive me for the use of, I didn't have a chance to think of good names for them. I don't know, probably they shouldn't have been named maybe. The ridiculous bill and the responsible bill. And the one was to, as one of our colleagues very aptly described it, a crash and learn. I want to acknowledge that I learned something during our meetings. But it really was where we would just, all right, fine. We would go out there and you say no increases, but this is what's going to happen. And we'll learn through it, and we'll suffer through it, and we'll crash and we'll learn. I want to thank all of you in our individual meetings. You made it clear that most of you were not willing to go through that. The second bill that I proposed, 323, which is now before us, initially proposed a 5.5 increase in the BPT. I want to thank again all of you for meeting with me privately to express your concerns. And I heard your concerns. I heard that you had very little appetite, if no appetite at all, for increasing the BPT another 0.5, right? Regardless of what it was going to be used for. There was just very little appetite for an increase in the BPT. I then posited to all of you the possibility that I had over these last several months been beaten up fairly regularly because I had introduced bills to try to address the shortfall by introducing and having public hearings on bills that were increasing revenue, and some were making drastic cuts, like the repeal of the CWA. After the beating all of us took during that hearing, I didn't think that was something that any of you wanted to think about as the possibility. I mean, that could be part of the ridiculous bill, but that's still out there. It's been heard. The committee report's ready, so if anybody wants to move that, that's fine. But I had also introduced, and we had public hearings on several bills. In April, we heard the increase in the cigarette, the sin tax, cigarettes and alcohol. And in our discussions, it didn't seem that I was able to cobble 8 of you together. Some of you had various reasons that you could or would not support an increase in the sin tax, though I would love that to be one of the last things that I do leaving here, but I didn't think that I was able to count 8, and I've learned that I have to count to 8. And so I want to thank you for making me come to that realization. We also had introduced the HOT, the hotel occupancy tax bill, and I said, well, that could be another source of revenue. There didn't seem to be much of an appetite to support that, or at least not right now. There was also the real property tax, changing the percentage of tax on the improvement, and I want to again emphasize, it's only on the improvement. The raw land underneath, the tax on that will not increase. The proposal is only to increase any improvements that are on that land. And so that was heard, and the OFB's estimate is that that could possibly raise us $23 million. After our discussions, and I realized that I didn't have support for 5.5, I sat down with OFB and said, all right, fine, let's just go to 5. The 5 would raise us about $60 million. I also want to make it known that 323 increased the cuts that were made by the fiscal realignment plan that was imposed on April the 1st. We took it to almost $50 million. And so you can see that in the comparisons, that the amounts are even less than the FRP was in February. But we did still try to address the priority of the hospital and education. After I spoke to OFB and we tried to figure out, all right, there's 60, how do we make up that $30 million difference that 0.5 was going to provide? We could count that maybe we could get 8 of you to agree to the business privilege tax. So how do we deal with that 0.7? During our meetings, Senator Espaldon reminded me that he had passed a bill on the RSP earlier, and there's a possibility of about a $2.8 million savings. I was singing, 2.8, how am I going to make up the difference, the additional 4 point something to meet that 7? And I was really just, though I've grown my hair back, I could have pulled all of it out trying to figure out how to make that 7 without an under. And Friday, thankfully, the Guam Retirement Fund posted on its website the fact that the government contribution to the retirement had gone down from 28.23 to 26.56. OFB went and made that calculation of how much that difference would make. We thought we could make that difference up there. And so it was the RSP and the Guam Retirement that made that difference between the property and the 30 that we needed to make. They spent the entire weekend going through trying to reduce everything to make sure that we had addressed that on each of the agencies. But that was the way that we were able to get it through. I knew as a starter that it would be a non-starter of a budget bill if we didn't address the hospital and the $30 million that the governor was trying to find for us to appropriate to the hospital. Maybe one of the future legislatures can make the Healthy Futures Fund as if they increase the sin tax at some later time. But right now, we cobbled together a couple of sources, Guam Retirement, the General Fund, the Healthy Futures Fund, and the Farm Fund to get the $30 million the hospital was going to need for its operations. And so that was the way that this bill was put together. So I want to thank all of you for giving me your input and for helping me with my behind-the-scenes counting and learning that I need 8 to do anything, and it can't be just me wanting to do something. It has to be 8 of us together that want to do something. So I want to thank all of you for meeting with me and being honest that if I proposed a real property tax that you would say no. I at least could ask others. Being honest about when I said, would you be able to support a sin tax? And some of you said no. So as it came out, and I think in the general community, there is not so much that anybody wants taxes. I mean, I don't want to be the one that's known for increasing taxes. But really, seriously, our real property tax is the lowest in the country. Even with this increase in the improvements section, it'll only move us to 49th place in the country. And still, we made sure that we didn't repeal the exemptions for those of us that are manamko and those of us that are disabled, the most vulnerable in the community. So that has stayed in place. Though I will be frank with you, I was at a Young Men's League of Guam function earlier this year, and one member came up to me and he said, you know where you can get some money is you could repeal that senior exemption. I looked at him and he goes, I know, I'm a senior and I know what it's like. He says, but it's ridiculous. He says, my bill was $190 and they actually asked me if I wanted to pay it in 2 installments. And this person was honest enough with me to say that though he was a senior and a $190 bill for his fairly substantial home was, he felt ludicrous. But we kept that in there because I know that there are many others out there who cannot afford an increase, or at least are on such fixed budgets that it'd be hard for them to address that. So that's how we arrived at this final version of the bill. I also wanted to make sure that after the Attorney General opined that the Charter School Council was within its authority to approve a extended charter to Guam Academy, that we placed that back in the bill. So as a consequence, you'll notice in the section as it relates to the charter schools that Guam Academy is back in. The enrollment caps that were set, or at least provided by the council, we've adhered to. 740, 500, and 350 for the new charter school CFA. We addressed that. We also, since everybody has taken the cuts, save for the hospital, the amount for the charter schools, we figured the percentage reduction that GDOE suffered overall, and we imposed that same reduction on the 6,500. So consequently, it went from 6,500 to 6,588. That percentage was 6.35 reduction for GDOE. So everybody has received a reduction. I know that some of you pointed out to me, well, why was this increase in the Mayor's Council? The Mayor's Council, remember last year when we used the recycling revolving fund to assist in making the budget for the Mayor's Council. One of our colleagues, Senator Estevez, very aptly pointed out that that was a violation of the recycling fund, but there was able to work together. We all worked together, and with the Mayor's Council was able to work some kind of MOU. This year, it's all going to have to be general fund. That's why it looks like they got an increase, but they didn't really get an increase. We're now trying as much as possible to adhere to the special funds provisions that we're tied with. In the budget bill, we also, I know that people, when we cut the 50 some million dollars, trying to figure out how to be able to do that, I know that there was this talk of, well, get rid of all the LTAs. When I mentioned that to OFB, they very aptly reminded me that you can't do that, sir, because a number of the bus drivers, nurses, are LTAs, and so you can't have a huge, just the provision that says no LTAs, though I would have loved to have done that. What I did put in was that in this budget it would not budget for nor could funds be used to pay for positions that are designated as deputies. There were some other savings that are fairly minor, but that was how this thing was cobbled together. What I tried to do was I tried to address what the community was saying. You've got to cut. This proposal almost doubles the cuts that were made in the FRP. Maybe not quite, but almost. It's now in statute. The FRP we never statutorized, so whether or not all that was actually implemented was, as was put at one of the hearings, on the honest system. But this time we put it into the budget bill, and those cuts are now imposed. I wanted to make sure that we addressed education, and so though there are cuts to education, the cuts were less than the 10% that they suffered in the FRP, but still, most of them were actually suffering some cuts. And then, after all those cuts were made, and we had the revenue that we could work with, and we took out the amounts that were to pay our bonds, I instructed OFB to go through and, using the budget digests that were provided to us in January and February and March by the administration, the digests that were provided, they went through and made sure that they covered for warm bodies, all warm bodies that are there. Then we tried to put back in contracts that were absolutely necessary for behavioral health and wellness, the respite care, the residential care of kids away. For DOC, we put the contracts back in that weren't in there to feed the inmates and provided for some of the money that was needed for the contract with the hospital. We were hoping that maybe we could use some compact impact, or whoever is governor would be able to use some compact impact money to make up the difference. But we tried to put the contracts back in. We went through, and supplies and office material, all that we tried to reduce as much as possible to try to get to the number that is now before us today. And so I believe I've covered everything. Again, I thank you all for having suffered through this with me, and for sitting and sending me your emails and your text, reminding me about certain things that need to be done, and but more importantly, for being frank and forthright in telling me I cannot support this or I can't support that, and so that I can come to the floor with something that I believe that most of us will be able to agree on. I know it's difficult, and it's not that I really want to have any increases in taxes. The 5% that we finally is in the bill is the 5% that was passed earlier this year. It's already been implemented. It's been in effect for the last 8 months, or would have been by October for the last almost 10 months. And as most of you have very aptly put it, there'd probably be no chance that that would be reduced. I mean, that the businesses, once it's in there, would actually reduce that. So continuing it past the 31st of September would not be that jarring. The real property tax is something that we need to address at some point, and so I'm hoping to get your support on that. I, again, want to thank and commend the OFB staff for really, and I mean it seriously, suffering through this with me. I mean, they've suffered quite a bit of abuse from me in making them this whole last week, 2 weeks and this last weekend, going through and writing and rewriting and writing and rewriting to try to come up with this thing, and adding and making sure that the numbers were there, and trying to find a way to make up that 7. And when I want to send Paula flowers to thank her for posting the GovGom contribution, because that really made up, because I kept trying to figure out, is it going to be cigarette tax? Is it going to be some other tax that we're going to have to do? Or are they going to have to go back and cut even some more? And I thought that we had already done a substantial cut, or at least with building from the ground up, that these were the bare minimum that these departments needed for their continued operations. And so I wasn't sure we could go back through and find another $4 million to cut. I also want to mention to all of you, I want to thank the OFB for going through that and making sure that we could find that savings, and really thank them for all the work that they've done for all of us over this last year. A very, very capable group of individuals. And just so you know, when you go through as we go through the budget, I know that some of you want to do some increases or address some special needs. Please, if you're going to do that, there has to be you have to find someplace else. This thing is balanced. And if you're going to increase in one other area, you're going to have to decrease some other area, or you're going to have to move to have passed some revenue generating bill that has already gone through a public hearing. And I know that some of you have had some fee increase hearings and other things. You can make those motions when we get to that section. But again, I just want to thank all of you for having endured this with me, and for my OFB staff for assisting in the preparation of this. With that, I'd like, I'm not sure, do we want to? You've all been provided with a copy of the rules. I don't need to read it over the air for everybody to hear, but please just have a chance to look at that as we go through. It's the same as last year's, and so with that, I'm not sure if is there anything I need? Do we want to go through that presentation, or we can start through, or just so that the community at large understands the revenue loss, if I can ask OFB to just walk us through that so that everybody understands the reality that we're facing. Okay? Oh.
Just, Mr. Speaker, could I ask also that just a slight amendment to the rules, because in Committee of the Whole we go detail by detail, but could we just allow some time at the end for general remarks on the bill if necessary?
Of course.
Thank you.
Okay, half a day, Senators. Everyone should have a copy of the presentation. This presentation is very similar to the one that was presented at the June 22nd SCS meeting. We're going to be going over the general fund revenue projections, more specifically the income tax and business privilege tax projections. So this is just an overview. It shouldn't take too long, but we're going to go over the FY18 income tax revenue analysis of how the projection for the reduction due to the TCJA has impacted actual collections, and a comparison to what we actually collected. We'll go over some economic indicators to establish our baseline, and we'll go over the general fund model and method and how we arrived at our FY19 projections, and we'll finalize that with the general fund revenue projections for the other income categories. So next slide. So that's our overview, and moving on to the next slide, we'll have the TCJA impact analysis. So for the last 5 months between February and June, the estimated impacted collections for income tax revenues was $182.7 million. That's how much we estimated to collect during that 5-month period. The actual collections was about $183.2 million. That's net of the non-recurring income tax of $13.2 million that was disclosed to us at the SCS meeting back in June, and the tax amnesty program, which was not expected when we made the initial impact analysis. So the variance was less than 1%. And again, through July through September, estimates might change based on further unforeseen non-recurring collections, further tax amnesty collections that we'll receive through August 6th, and then any additional rev tax increased collection efforts as compared to previous fiscal years. Next slide. I'm just going to go quickly over these economic indicators. I know many have already gone through these. This has been posted on the OFB website. But we'll go over the real gross domestic product, or real GDP. This is taken from the U.S. Department of Commerce, Bureau of Economic Statistics. We'll go over the current employment statistics from the Guam DOL, Bureau of Labor Statistics. Construction data taken from Guam DOL, Alien Labor Division, and some building permit data from the Guam DOL as well. Military appropriations versus spending. This is from GITA's website, and as well as USA Spending. And just some visitor arrivals taken from GVB. So next slide. I'll be going over these economic indicators. The reason for this is just to establish the justification for the baseline we used for general fund revenue projections for FY19. So on this slide, you'll notice that the real GDP, most recent data is through 2016, but we note that between 2009 and 2016, there's been continued growth. It has slowed down over the past 2 reported years to a little bit less than 1%. We do expect that slight growth to continue. Whether it's at 1%, we'll see until we'll know when the new data comes out. This is provided by the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis. And so we expect moving forward, given this data, that there should be at least levelized growth or moderate growth in the next few fiscal years. Next slide, and I'll be going through these quickly. Employment, this is the number of employees employed on the island. And you'll note that it's been consistently about 61 to 63,000, and we expect that to continue. We don't expect employment to go down, and so that provides us some justification, at least based on the data, to establish our baselines that we'll go over in the next few slides. Next slide is the average weekly earnings. This is organized by public and then private sector. And we note that private sector wages has been consistent, a little under $500 per week. This is weekly earnings across all different private sector industries, and then public sector as well has seen slight increases. So this provides us at least some justification that our baseline, if we have no expectation that these levels of weekly earnings will drop, therefore providing additional justification for our baseline. The next slide we have is H-2B workers, average per year. So we've seen in the this year and last fiscal year that H-2B worker count has gone down, but based on our discussions with Guam DOL, that expectation for next fiscal year would be in the neighborhood of about 1,500 H-2B workers. This is based on the actual applications. I think it was a few weeks ago, it was about 2,020 that have applied, and I have yet to speak with them today, but the assumption is that there probably could be a little bit more, but this slide is based on discussions a few weeks ago, and the expectation is that even prior to FY19 beginning in October, that we should have about 1,000 at least H-2B workers approved by USCIS. And so the expectation is that we'll have about 1,500 H-2B workers in FY19. And next slide. Given that assumption, this next slide is just an overlay of that H-2B slide, but with BPT related to contracting. So this is contracting BPT revenues. And so the last time we had about 1,500 workers on Guam was between FY14 and 16. It kind of fluctuated a little bit less than 1,500, but with the expectation of that many more H-2B workers in FY19, we expect the contracting BPT revenues to be similar to the years FY14 through 16. And so we'll talk about how that impacts the revenues in the next few slides, but that's our expectation. Next slide is just a slide of building and construction permits. So this is taken again from DOL, Guam DOL. And our expectation here, again, is that building permits that's been approved by Public Works has consistently been about or above about $400 million. That's the value of the building permits. And so we don't expect that to drop, but we do expect that these building permits that are approved to actually lead to occupancy permits. And so with the increase in the number of H-2B workers, we expect that these building permits will be filled and occupancy permits can be issued. And again, this is just an overlay. The next slide is just an overlay of contracting BPT revenues as it relates to the building permits. Next slide is just a comparison of military appropriations versus the spending. We'll note that in FY 18 and 19, I believe the projection here, it says 377 million. I think the Senate version was a little bit less, 300. It was over 300 million, but I think it was 320 some million in the Senate version of the NDAA for FY19. But we do have a large gap here in terms of the actual spend to the authorized spend. And with the increase in construction workers, we expect that gap to fill and the spend to actually be at the level authorized in the NDAAs. So there's a lot, the gap that you see between the red and blue line, we hope will be filled. We expect that to be filled and will hopefully lead to increased BPT revenues related to contracting. Last slide regarding economic indicators, our last two slides, is related to visitor arrivals. We'll note these are projections from GVB, and the last projection we received at the SES meeting was that we'll have approximately 1.57 million visitors arrive in FY19. This was prior to the announcement of the additional flights from United, not additional flights and a larger aircraft from United, as well as the additional routes from the other airlines, Japan Airlines and the Osaka line on Jeju Airline. So we expect this. We agree with GVB. They're the experts, and we agree in terms of their projected visitor arrivals. And the next slide we have is just a overview of the visitor arrivals on retail and service related GRT or BPT. And so you'll note here that service BPT we expect to be 61 million in FY19 and retail BPT to be 108 million. These are very, very modest increases. The service BPT increase a little less than 3%. Retail BPT is a little over 1%. So we expect those to increase with the increase in visitor arrivals. So next slide is our general fund model, basically the method that we employed to come up with our general fund revenues for income taxes and BPT. So we first established a baseline revenues, and all the economic indicators that we just went over establishes that baseline revenue. And so our baseline that we used, because FY18 has a lot of variables, we have Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that impacts 7 months of the fiscal year. We had the BPT 5% that impacts half of the fiscal year. We used the baseline, to establish our baseline, we used the 2-year collection rate for FY16 and 17. Those years were not impacted by any of these things that have been impacting FY18. And so we used an average of those 2 years to establish our baseline. From there, we applied the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act impacts. And after that, we add the data points outside the baseline, projected increase in H-2B workers that impact on withholding taxes, as well as contracting BPT, projected increase in construction activity that would increase BPT, projected increase in insurance BPT. This one I haven't discussed, but in relation to insurance companies that have QCs and of which QCs reduce our GRT collections. One insurance company's QC needed to be renewed in January, and it wasn't. I believe there's one other insurance company that's set to expire in November, and then the third insurance company set to expire in May next year. So we expect a projected increase in insurance-related BPT related to these non-renewals. And I believe in the Budget Act there's a provision in there that continues the moratorium set by executive order on not renewing these QCs. And lastly, the projected increase in retail and service BPT. So I'm just going to kind of put a visual in terms of the numbers and how we get from point A to B to C to D. And the next slide is just the establishment of the baseline. Okay, so this is your FY16 and 17 audited numbers for income taxes and GRT. So that is the column A plus column B divided by 3. That establishes your pre-tax cuts baseline. Okay. Next slide. So you take your pre-tax cut baseline and you apply the income tax or the tax cuts impact. For this, as an example, corporate taxes, the reduction from 35% to 21%, we estimate it to be a 40% reduction. So we just applied a 40% reduction to our baseline. Same with withholding. Withholding, we estimated it to be an 18% reduction. So we applied that 18% reduction to our baseline, and so forth. And so our total income tax impact on the baseline is a reduction of 110 million. If you did compare this to FY18 numbers, you would see the $140 million impact. But again, we're comparing it to the baseline and not FY18 revenue figures. And so that's how we came up with our Tax Cuts and Jobs Act reduced baseline numbers. And next slide. From that reduced baseline, we added our data points outside of the baseline. And with this, we have a withholding data point outside the baseline of 6.78 million. We justified that with the additional 1,500 H-2B workers and the withholding taxes that would be taken from or be collected from those additional paychecks. For business privilege taxes, we estimated an additional 11.5 million. That's related to these service retail BPT increase, the insurance BPT increases because of the QCs not being renewed, as well as the contracting BPT increases. And so that with those data points outside of the baseline, we come up with our FY19 revenue projection for 4 of the largest general fund revenue categories. Note that business privilege tax at 249.22 million is at 4%. And if we go to the next slide, it's a little bit hard to see on the TV, but in summary, this is the summary of the total general fund revenues that'll be available to appropriate, that were appropriated in the bill in front of everyone. This one of note here, we have GRT at 311.5 million. That's just math. That's just straight math, taking the 249 baseline that we, or projection that we calculated in the previous slide, and increasing that to 5% BPT. Of note on this slide is section 30. We kept it at 68.6 million, which is the same number that we expected this year, in the expectation that the war claims would be swept. Anything in addition to that would be swept to pay for war claims. And so that, obviously open up to questions, but that ends the, at least my presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Hernandez. Did anybody have any questions of the presentation that was made? Madam Vice Speaker?
Just one. Is the TCJA impact the same as the estimate you gave at the SES meeting, or did you amend that?
The only changes from the SES meeting was if you go to the slide that shows FY16 and 17 audited, the only changes from the SES meeting was that we received the audit after that meeting, and so we updated the FY17 from unaudited to audited numbers.
Okay, thank you. Good job, thanks.
Senator Torres.
Going back to one of the first two slides that you presented, I just wanted a little more clarity on the slide with regard to the 5-month periods, and you had a non-recurring income tax collection. I just wanted some clarity about why that 13.2 is non-recurring. I understand your subsequent explanations on baseline revenues and all the factors, but what was the justification for that 13.2 non-recurring?
The 13.2, that was identified by BB Marr at the SES meeting as being non-recurring. Non-recurring, I guess the definition of that would be that it was probably a corporate or individual income taxpayer possibly paying taxes that were due in prior years and they just caught up. Or it could be that there was some, I'd say, large, an event that was large enough that would yield that much income tax in one year that we did not expect and isn't what was collected in prior years.
And
so
it's separate and apart from the amnesty. This is an actual
this
payment
actually,
of a catch-up perhaps, or?
It was collected prior to the amnesty.
Uh-huh.
We don't like to speculate on what it would be, but it could be that it wasn't identified as either. I think it was identified as a corporate tax, non-recurring.
Okay.
And so it could be related to, anything, a large sale of property and so forth.
Okay.
Yeah, but we don't have any details in relation to what caused it. That would be Department of Revenue Taxation. But again, they wouldn't disclose any taxpayer information. So it was just identified by BB Marr at the SES meeting as non-recurring.
During that 5-month period. The other thing that I noticed in the budget is the pharmaceutical fund, GMHA. Why a significant decrease in that amount?
So pharmaceutical fund is an offset. So 6.19% of BPT collections goes to the pharmaceutical fund. So it's just as a percentage of what the revenues projection is.
Okay, thank you very much.
Vice Speaker?
Thank you. So the tax amnesty collections after August 6th are not included anywhere here?
No.
Okay, just want to make sure.
Not in the FY19 projection.
Mike, did you? After Senator Nelson, then Senator Snickles. Senator Nelson, go ahead.
Thank you. In your FY 2019 TCJ impact on baseline, can you just bring up that slide, please? So this is for the people that are watching, Mr. Speaker, because really the shortfall is real. We know that the government does have $140+ million shortfall. It's very real for all of us. But the issue is that there's a trust issue. Why is this shortfall happening? Where is this money coming from? And how is that going to impact the economy as a whole on our island? And so if Ricky could just explain this slide in the most simplest terms, the TCJ impact on the revenue reduction to the government, but the TCJ impact on corporations and businesses out in our community, to explain perhaps the comparison of the products that are being put on our shelves. In the most simplest terms, explain this to the community, how this impacts the businesses in relation to how it impacts our government. Can we do that?
I think in that slide, all that we wanted to show was we took the baseline, and like for corporate taxes, we did the multiplication. The 14% reduction from 35 to 21 was 40% of the 35. And so consequently, we multiplied the baseline times 0.60 to take the 40% discount reduction.
But the impact that the Trump Tax Cuts Jobs Act,
Right.
the impact that it has on the businesses. And so if we could just reiterate the impact, the positive benefits that it has on the businesses and the negative impacts that it has on the government collecting.
What it meant was that the impact was that corporations, C corporations, would get this as, they wouldn't have to pay this tax, this 14, from 21 to 35. They wouldn't have to make that tax payment. That's a positive for the corporation. What the corporation does with that is the corporation's to do. There's nothing we can do about it. We can hope that they would reinvest it. We can hope that they would increase the minimum wage or the wages of their employees. But unless we pass legislation to increase the minimum wage, we're not going to affect their decision to increase the wages of their employees. That would be all individual, that would be all personal to each individual corporation. Some corporations, I understand, are reinvesting. Some are actually increasing some of their wages for their employees. Some, but we can't control that unless we increase the wages, I mean the law as it relates to minimum wage. As it relates to withholding, that reduction in the savings, every employee notices that their biweekly paycheck has increased by about 20%, save for maybe the increase in your retirement fund or something. But there was an increase in your take-home pay because of the Trump Tax Act. So there's more spending by the people. They have that ability of that additional 20% to spend. Whether they spend it or they save it is again an individual decision that the people are making. That's all, unless that is...
No, thank you, Mr. Speaker, for pointing that out, because it's imperative for the people to understand that essentially these corporations are getting a 14% tax break. And I'm just bringing back historically, when we went through the public hearings, we had all these corporations and of course some consumers that were upset about the 5% BPT. But failing to realize, I mean, even some of my colleagues were trying to take away some of the QCs, and perhaps as a body we had challenges with passing those exemptions, lifting those exemptions. But as a community, it has to be understood that the tax break in these corporations that are given 14%, and the tax withholdings, which is a 20% increase in our paychecks, and the 5% BPT that the body is proposing, or the 5.5%, should not impact consumer products if the businesses were acting in accordance of perhaps, I don't know the word, in honesty to not harm the economy, because there is a 14% tax break for these corporations. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Senator Nicholas?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Several items. The first I wanted to discuss was, first I wanted to thank Office of Finance and Budget for putting this together. I think it gives us a good place to start from when it comes to having a conversation about the impact of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. I first wanted to go to the slide that was previously put up that showed the impact of the TCJA, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. If we can get that slide up, please. So, Mr. Chairman, the impact is showing there 110 million, but we've been told that the shortfall is going to be 140 or thereabouts. Could we first get an understanding of where the other $30 million is short?
Okay, so for that slide, it shows 110 million as compared to the pre-TCJA baseline. If you compared it to the FY18 adopted revenues, it would show 138.28 million. So I know in the slides, it's not on the slide, but I'll just kind of read it. The FY18 adopted number revenue for individual income taxes was 78.34 million. The projection is 66.41. The variance would be about 12 million. Corporate taxes for FY18 adopted was 152 million. The projection for FY19 is 83.7 million, a variance of about 69 million. Withholding adopted revenue was 281.2 million for FY18. The expected projection is 223 million. The variance there, or shortfall, is 57.5 million, totaling about 138.28 million.
So I'm just trying to reconcile, Mr. Chairman, is our shortfall larger because our budget was bigger in 2018 than it's going to be going forward? And the reason why I'm asking that is because from other news reports that I've gathered, we're tracking to have a surplus for 2018. So how are we tracking to have a surplus for 2018 and then our TCJA numbers are coming in much lower going into 2019? If the 2018 numbers were over projected based on this baseline.
I don't see how we could possibly come up with a surplus unless I really don't, because we know that we're not getting the cash. I mean, the amount of cash that we thought that we were going to get. So I'm just not sure, unless they just, like they went through and imposed a 23% cut on GDOE and the courts and the university. That's the only place, like in last year's, where they came up with a surplus. They claimed there's a surplus, but we know that we appropriated almost $30 million more to those three agencies, and they didn't receive it. And they're not paying them or not releasing that money to them resulted in their, again, air quote, surplus. But I think our projection of the revenue and what we appropriated came out almost on point.
As we move forward with this budget discussion, Mr. Chairman, I think that the community understands the need for us to make adjustments to address the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act impact. How we address that, I think, is what we have open to debate. But I think that the first thing we need to reconcile is what the impact is. Is the impact 140 million, or is the impact, as that slide has shown, 110 million? Because if it's 110 million, then I think that's the starting point from where we need to figure out how to raise revenues and establish cuts to come up with that $110 million impact.
The impact is 138. It was from looking at 16 and 17 as the baseline. The 18 was different because we had projected an increase for 18, which wasn't realized when those cuts went through in the fourth month. And so we had downward collections. I'll let Rakita explain.
Yeah, I just want to make it clear, at least in terms of the slide that shows the TCJA impact, that these slides that come up with the baseline and come up with our FY19 revenue projections, that slide that shows the TCJA impact is just the impact on our pre-TCJA baseline. Comparing the pre-TCJA baseline to the FY18 adopted revenues, obviously there will be a difference, but pre-TCJA baseline revenues is really just the second step in trying to create a revenue projection for 19. The comparison of the end product of our projection should be the one that is compared to the adopted levels. Pre-TCJA baseline, like on that slide, is just a step in the process to get to the FY19 projection. It's not what we're collecting. It's just essentially an average of the last two non-impacted fiscal years. It's not what we're collecting in 18. And so when we look at the product of the projection, which is the FY19 projection in the Budget Act in front of everyone, depending on what you want to compare it to, you can compare it to the adopted levels for FY18. You can compare it to tracking levels. It could be compared to a number of things, but in what Speaker has mentioned, the shortfall would be is the adopted levels in FY18, because those adopted levels were what the appropriation levels were, or the spending levels were compared to, or were based on. And so it could be compared to a number of things, but comparing it to the adopted levels, because those are the spending levels, is, I guess, what Speaker has been comparing it to.
I'm just trying to really get a handle on this, Mr. Speaker, because if the pre-TCJA baseline is basically what our revenues would have been before the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and if the FY 2018 projections were as close, as accurate as you're saying they were based on prior budgets that have been accurate, then wouldn't the pre-TCJA baseline, the baseline prior to the cuts, wouldn't that equal to what the projections were and the adopted revenues were for FY 2018? Because basically what this is saying now is that our baseline before the cuts was lower than what we actually adopted in 2018. For example, if we look at this slide here, individual pre-TCJA baseline is 72.98 million. But if you go to the second to the last slide, on Public Law 3442, adopted revenues is 78.34 million. So why was our revenues adopted at 78, but now we're saying that our baseline is 72? Because when we lower the baseline and then we factor out the impact, it really squeezes our revenues even lower. And I'm trying to just get a starting point on how to reconcile the numbers here. Is our baseline what our adopted revenues were in 2018, or is our baseline now coming in at lower?
I'll allow Ricky to respond to that, but it's not.
Yeah, so the use of a baseline is really a function of trying to get our revenue, or calculate our revenue projections. Baseline is not what we expect to collect. It's just setting a baseline that allows us to move forward with our FY19 projection. I guess the assumption that the pre-TCJA baseline is what we expect to collect is the use of that without using any growth rates is a very conservative approach. In prior years, we've used a baseline with some growth rate percentages. So using 16 and 17, we won't know what would have happened in 18 if Tax Cuts and Jobs Act didn't occur. Our assumption is that the adopted revenues would have been achieved. But since we don't know what would have happened if Tax Cuts Jobs Act didn't occur, we use the adopted level. FY18 is obviously higher than FY17 because there were assumptions made last year that there would be growth. And because those growth levels couldn't be achieved because of certain things that happened, that would have happened this year, including Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we won't know what FY18 is if that didn't happen. And so the comparison of baseline to adopted, it's kind of difficult to project because we just don't know what FY18 would have collected if BPT was an increase of 5%, if tax cuts didn't impact income taxes. But the use of adopted numbers is we feel is prudent because that's what we hoped to collect. The use of baseline here is a very conservative figure because 16 and 17, obviously, there has been growth in general fund revenues. So 16 and 17 are actually, we expected to be lower than 18 because in 18, we expected some growth in every single category. So using that as a baseline is an extremely conservative approach in terms of our FY19 projection. Because typically, in a typical year, we would use the current year tracking, which would be considerably higher, or should we expect to be higher than prior years. But because we can't use this year as a baseline, there's just too many variables to try and normalize that data. We use 16 and 17 as a very, very conservative baseline. So that helps.
Mr. Speaker, usually when we do budgets, we do the incoming fiscal year's budgets based on what was adopted for the prior fiscal year's budgets. Now what we're saying is that we're using a baseline that's lower than what we adopted in the prior fiscal year. I can understand that going into FY 2019, we're going to need to factor in the cuts, but to factor in the cuts on what we're now going to say is a lower starting point is increasing the pain threshold, and I'm not quite sure why. For example, if we go back to that slide that I brought up, it mentions here that the baseline is 237.72 million for business privilege tax. It's the other slide. Well, I'm also going to reference that one too. But our adopted revenue for business privilege tax was 254 million. Now, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act didn't impact BPT. So why is our baseline going into FY 2019 going to be at 237 million when our adopted revenues were 254 million, and none of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act should have reduced the BPT. In fact, it should have actually stimulated, which will be the next topic of discussion. So why are we using a $237 million BPT baseline when our $254 million 2018 number should not have been impacted?
The 237 was the audited 16 and 17 amounts. I know that we had projected, and I know that some of you had questioned those two fiscal years' projections, but that's what it actually came in audited. That's where that number came from the final audited report. We've always worked on the assumption that for every % of the business privilege tax, we get 60. As we have seen in those two completed audits, it wasn't 60 per 1% in grocery in business privilege tax, because as you've gone through the month, there hasn't been 20 per month. There have been 19, 18, 21s. But in September, again, it bounces up a little bit when all the tax refunds go out. But and in the end, audited, it came out 237. So that's why we were using what we were able to find in the audits as the amount, not so much what we were hoping it was going to be at and projected it to be, but used as the baseline, the actual collections for that year. I don't know if that.
On that note, Mr. Speaker, and the reason why I thought it was very important to bring it up is that if we were using the FY 2018 adopted revenues just on business privilege tax alone, if we were using the $254 million, and if we were factoring what was the next slide up there, the prevailing economic variables, we're looking at an $11.5 million increase in BPT on the prevailing economic variables. Basically, what that slide shows is, what that slide up there shows is that the benefits of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is supposed to increase business privilege tax economic activity by 11.5 million. If we were still using the $254 million BPT revenue number, we would actually have $266 million in BPT to budget for. But now that we're walking that backwards, we're basically saying that we need to take we're taking a $17 million reduction on projections on top of the impact of the tax cuts.
Yes, because we're trying to be as accurate as possible. The BPT has been aggressive in the last 3 years. It's been always a little more than actually collected. And it's shown in the audit that we never got to 240. We never got to 247, I think it was, for this year, or 254, because the baseline and just trying to look at it accurately, or as honestly as possible, is I've been trying to get OFB to check that number, because we've been doing the 3% increase over the previous year, and I keep saying we never got to it. You can't use that, so that's why they've had to, at my instruction, use the audited amount, because I didn't want to use what was in the previous budget bills as the amounts, to try to give us as accurate a reading as possible.
So when we're factoring, for example, the 1% increase in the BPT, that is not based on the 254, that's based on the 249.
Yes. Senator Egan?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and to OFB for providing the information. So just to follow up on that line of question, so are we looking at $140 million, or are we looking at 110 based on the presentation? Because I know and I understand that the numbers are originating from fiscal year 16 as well as fiscal year 17, and they're conservative. The 110, which is reflective on page 9 of the TCJA impact. So what are we working with at this point in time? Because I know that you just reiterated $140 million. So is it 140 or 110 based on the presentation?
So relative to reductions, right? Because when you compare next year to this fiscal year, it just depends. The number, obviously, the variance would differ. If you would use adopted revenues, it would be 138.23 million, as compared to FY19 projections. If you used another figure for FY18, the FRP, it would be something different. What Speaker has been using in every instance is the FY18 adopted number. In terms of what that reduction is, I think the comparison of or the use of the term reduction is relative to what you're comparing to, if it's the adopted, the tracking, or the baseline. In either case, it'll be a different number. And so what we did in FY19 is we did our projection based on the methodology that has been explained this morning, and the FY19 spending was based on a building from the ground up, funding full-time employees or equivalency positions, funding rent, utilities, and continuing contractual obligations, and then really taking a look at supplies, equipment, and so forth. And so depending on what one would want to compare to, you'd see 138.23 million reduction, quote unquote reduction, but you know, it's really relative to what you're comparing to. And so the budget as presented is balanced. The spending is less than or equal to the revenue projection, and how we built those the spending side is as explained by Speaker and myself.
So the numbers that are incorporated in the amended version is reflective of fiscal year 18 numbers transposed with the TCJA impact. Is that what we're looking at? So that's where the $140 million would be justified versus looking at actual revenues that were collected in 16 and 17. And Mr. Hernandez, that's where I'm questioning it, primarily because you're presenting numbers based on actual numbers and audited numbers based on 16 and 17, recognizing that 18 is when, in fact, the TCJA has impacted our government revenues. But in the same token, that $140 million projected Tax Cut Act impact keeps being thrown out versus your presentation here. Mm-hmm. And that's why I wanted to understand exactly where are we at? Are we looking at 110? Are we looking at 140? And just based on the budget that's being presented, 323.
Yeah. So I think for me, what's important is what the projection is, and not necessarily what we're reducing it by. Because, like I said, you can compare it to any number, any tracking adopted. It really is, what is the FY19 projection? We came up with that notwithstanding what happens in FY18, which is why we use 16 and 17. And so I believe what is at least important to us is that what's the FY19 projection? We came up with that independently of adopted numbers of FY18 and so forth. And what we came up with, then you can start comparing it to. So we didn't look at FY18 revenues and then say, how do we reduce this? We came up with our methodology of establishing our baseline, pre-tax cuts, applying the tax cuts based on the reduction in the percentages, and then we came up with a projection in FY19. And so the comparison or the discussion of reduction, as Speaker has continued to mention, the reduction is based off of a comparison to FY18 adopted numbers. But what's important, at least to us, is that what is that FY19 number? And then you start comparing it to whatever needs to be compared to. What we know is that FY19, that's our projection is X, and the FY19 spending and appropriation levels is also equal to X. And so whether one would want to compare it to 17, 16, or 15, you'll get different variations. But at least what's important to us is that our FY19 projection is based on a methodology that has been used in the past, and the spending levels based on those revenue projections are at or equal to the revenue projections. And so the comparison, how much did we reduce revenues versus how much did we reduce spending is really relative to what you're comparing to. And so the reason why Speaker had compared it to adopted levels is because that's the adopted spending levels.
But then, Mr. Hernandez, then why would you have presented the baseline presentation for fiscal year 16 and 17 when we're going off of the projected revenue on fiscal year 18 and looking at the $140 million figure? And that's really where the question, the underlying question is, because based on your presentation here, I'm looking at $110 million, which is conservative. Yeah. Which is conservative, and you also admitted to it, and also I believe the Speaker may have. So I'm working off a $110 million TCJA impact based on your presentation, but then every now and then I hear this $140 million figure. And if we are going to base it on projected revenues for fiscal year 18, then we should stay with that particular baseline versus the presentation here, because this is a lot more conservative, and the 110 is, I would think, is closer to the number. The other question I have, Mr. Speaker, is we understand the proposed revenue enhancement or increase in taxes. What is the projected, just looking at the budgetary presentation, what is the projected reduction in expenses for the government of Guam going into fiscal year 2019?
In Bill 323, the reduction from 18 is 57?
So 57 mil. Can I just ask
57.
just a general question, Mr. Speaker, because when we were discussing fiscal year 18, there was a commitment, or there was an anticipation by this body that the administration was going to reduce the expenses of the government of Guam by $30 million. And they have come out repeatedly and said they are reducing it by $31 million. So just looking at that, so you're saying that we're going off of fiscal year 2018 budget, so that $30 million should be taken off the top. So 57 less 30. So we're asking the government to reduce expenditures by $27 million?
Yes, that's why I said we almost doubled the FRP. I didn't say we doubled. We almost doubled the FRP. We went from the 30 to 57. And as you can see from the comparison charts that we presented, I don't know if you got a copy of that. There was one earlier one which had the FRP in there. The FRP number and this number shows that the amount that's being appropriated is $27 million less than what was the FRP number. So we're trying as much as possible to continue that downward expenditure.
So we're anticipating, based on the budget that's being presented, that the $30 million is already an extracted expenditure reduction.
Correct.
So fiscal year 2019 is
An
requiring
additional
that
27.
expenditures continue to be contained or reduced by an additional $27 million.
Correct. That's why DOE is also still losing an additional amount from what its FRP was, not the drastic one where they were being proposed to take them down 65, but just a couple of, about 10 million. Okay.
I'm just saying that if in fact the $30 million is already taken off the top in 18, and that cost reduction or expenditure reduction of the government expenses should transpose itself and continue on to fiscal year 19, then really we're looking at a net expenditure reduction by the government of Guam of $27 million for fiscal year 19. Okay, thank you,
Yes.
Mr. Speaker.
And also, going back to your first issue, I'm confident of the calculation that OFB has provided to us as far as the loss of 140, because in real numbers, we looked at the numbers that we had for collections till June, and our projection of what the collection was going to be was off by 0.28. At 183. If we took out the anomaly of that 13 million and the tax amnesty, we were practically on point. And so that's why I'm confident that the calculation form that they used is correct. Others have come in and insisted that it should have been a 3% reduction, and I tried to explain to them that the 3% reduction meant that it was going to be, or a 4% reduction, meant that it was actually a 20% reduction in withholding, not just the 3. In the same way that I keep getting corrected, the 1% increase in the BPT from 4 to 5 is not a 1% increase, it's a 20% increase. I mean, a 25% increase, you know, and it's depending on where it's compared to. But a 1% reduction from the 5% would be a 20% reduction. It just, you see how strange that can be. But when I had them check, and looking at the last 6 months, I'm fairly confident that the numbers that they're presenting to me, I made them go through it, and when they showed me that it was that amount, and I told them that this year I was not going to buy a dream BPT amount because all these other factors were going to be taken into consideration. I wanted a baseline and said, all right, fine, this increase is all we're going to be able to. This is probably the most conservative that I've ever been and insisted on. I know that in the past some of you have thought that it was either too aggressive but this one, I have made them come and explain every single number to me, and made sure that it was something that I could come to you with.
I'll just close with this statement, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, is it comes back again to the overall presentation. You know, when you're presenting baseline figures on 16 and 17, actual revenues collected, and then some of the discussion takes off from that and looks at fiscal year 18 revenues and expenditures. That's where questions come in terms of, okay, which is exactly the baseline? Because if we go fiscal year 18, you're right, $140 million anticipated reduction in total revenues. If you go based on the baseline of 16 and 17, which I consider, and I agree with you, that it's conservative, we're looking at a $110 million impact for the entire fiscal year. So it all depends on the presentation and which numbers we're going to be utilizing. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Ricky.
Thank you. Any other senator on this presentation? Yeah, Senator Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to also thank the OFB team for the presentation. On page 5, I'm just wondering how the H-2B workers and contracting BPT and the building permits, how they correlate. And I find it interesting on the workers and contracting BPT on 2016, 2017, and FY 2018, and how we knew what happened with the H-2B workers, and we saw that big drop or decline of those 3 previous years. And then we look at the building permits here on 2016 and 2017, and we kind of see it's status quo with the building and construction permits. And then on 2019, you're projecting basically a status quo of or restoring back to that 1,500 H-2B workers. And the projection for FY 2019 is slightly lower than the FY 2016 and 2017 numbers. Is there a reason for that, and how we're monitoring these realignment projects versus how much we're projecting the workers coming in? Because when I look at these numbers in previous years with the chart here, I'm just wondering how they correlate. One, again, 2016, 2017, big drop, but the construction permits, building permits, state status quo. Then we expect a big spike. We're seeing the applications coming in and getting approved. DOL has made it clear they expect to be at those status quo numbers at 1,500 H-2B workers again, but we are still projecting slightly lower than the FY 2016 and 2017 building and construction permits. I'm just wondering if we are, is there a difference with how much workers coming in with versus what we are anticipating with the military realignment projects?
I think it's a combination of things. I think it's the points to the resiliency of the construction industry and the fact that they are hiring local. If any of you have tried over the last year and a half to hire a handyman to try to assist in any of the projects that you're trying to do in small projects at your homes, you will note that their asking price has gone up considerably. And the cost of construction, the complaint has been in that though yes, you can get some construction projects started now, the cost of it is substantially higher because it's either using U.S. laborers or local laborers, thankfully, but it is at a higher cost. That all gets back to the H2 thing of whether or not it is or is not necessary, and how much, you know, whether or not we're willing to not have that assistance here. That's all another, it's not part of this. It was just trying to show that we hope that we're going to be able to go up with this increase in H2 laborers, that the withholding will go back up because of the fact that we'll be able to get their withholding at least. Whether or not that's going to translate into them buying more stuff outside, I don't know. A little bit it's taken into account, but it's just trying to show that all these numbers sometimes escape me, but it's just, I know that when I try to hire a handyman, where it used to cost $100 a day per guy, it's now costing $150 a day, if not more, to have them come and help. So it's a combination of both.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe it's very clear that we are seeing the application approvals. There has been very aggressive, and I think DOL is trying to move those much more quicker in getting these things through. However, again, I'm just wondering why that number of FY 2019 is still slightly lower. If we're just taking a very conservative approach to this, or are we versus the big spike? And I know my understanding, the approval cap, I believe, is at 4,000, or I believe 4,500. But when I'm looking at this chart, it just shows that that turnaround in approvals, or that number, and how it correlates with the BPT or the construction permits. It's still lower. I was just thinking it would be at least status quo with the projection, get back up there, and would increase from there as we see approvals. My understanding is you're bringing in these workers because there's more contracts that are being cleared and moving through the process already. So I'm just wondering if we're just taking a very conservative number here, or how we monitoring these projects, and how we capture BPT on these projects coming in.
I'll have to admit that, yes, we are taking a conservative number.
Okay, thank you, Mr.
For right now. Thank you. Any other questions? If not, let's get to the bill at hand.
Mr. Chairman, if I may?
Go ahead.
Before we actually get into the bill, I would like for us to make some time to discuss some observations with respect to the spreadsheets that you provided, because these kind of give us a baseline from which we go into the conversations within the bill.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a couple quick questions. The first is, for the T's and lease at the end of the spreadsheet, we have 10.1 million in terms of cost of that lease. Is that strictly for the school, or is that inclusive of the admin building?
Everything that's a T's and.
Is it one lease, or is it separate leases? Because from what I understand, the school was the first lease, and separate leases were entered into for the admin building.
As I understand it, there may be separate deals on it, but it's still one sum that's owed. I can provide you copies of at least 10 letters over the last 2 years where I've asked the governor to renegotiate the lease because for the last 2 years, the admin building and the warehouses have not been put up, and asking to renegotiate so we can bring that number down, or even better, to find that the breach of the contract and cancel the contract. I've not been able to even get the decency of a response.
The
But
reason why I
have
want
tried.
to bring this up now, Mr. Speaker, is because the way municipal leases work is one of the reasons why they don't count towards our debt ceiling, is because they are always subject to appropriation by the body. And so if we do have separate leases for the school, for the admin building, and for the warehouses, I'm okay with appropriating the amounts for the school, because of course we need the school to operate. But if now is the time for us to have the conversation about vacating the appropriation for the lease of the admin building and the warehouse, I would very much like to put that conversation on the table, because from what I understand, it could be a substantial amount in the millions of dollars.
When we get to that, I would be open to you bringing them in and asking them. Let me tell you, I have tried and tried and tried. I mean, I criticized them from the first decision, but I've been just wailing at the moon by myself.
The reason why I want to have this conversation in advance of getting to that particular section in the budget is because of the way the rules have been established. We're only allowed to speak one time on every item, and so I want to have a handle on what's on the table up front, so that as we go into the bill, we can begin figuring out how things move. So that's one item that I wanted to reconcile before we even get into the bill, is what's on the table with respect to the municipal leases that we are definitely going to want to keep, like the schools, but that we might want to vacate, like admin buildings and warehouses. That's one item, Mr. Speaker. The other item that I wanted to pose a question on is compact impact. I know that historically our government has never budgeted for it. It's discretionary spending by the governor. But I have raised on several points already that at this juncture, when we're talking about raising taxes on our people, I don't think any leader on this island can consider any money discretionary. And so I wanted to ask, how much is compact impact projected to be for this coming fiscal year? And put that on the table as well as something we can potentially factor into the budget for operations.
As I understand it, Guam's share of the compact impact appropriated is about 13 million, and half of that is already committed under the municipal leases for schools, for Estumbo, Atacao, Okadu, and Liguan, I think. Okay, so that amount is there. Let me tell you, if there's a way that you guys can force this issue, I'm game. I have tried. The Tijan one, I've written I don't know how many letters and criticized both GDOE and the administration for it, but can get I can't get a response even, not even action on it. Madam Vice Speaker, I'm sorry, are you done?
Just one more point that I can yield, Mr. Speaker. I also wanted to put on the record that the budget is calling for an increase in the dwelling component of the real property tax. Real property taxes aren't coming in until February. That's when the actual cash hits the bank. And so when it comes to funding this government, the RPT increases that are proposed in the bill aren't necessary on a cash basis until February. And the reason why I wanted to raise that as a point is because we have a lot of candidates running for office who are talking about reorganizing and are talking about focusing on collections as a means for making up on the shortfall. And the reality is that come January, we may very well have a new administration in office. And it may be more prudent for us to consider budgeting with the intent of allowing for that new administration to instead use their campaign promises to make up for the shortfalls rather than us jumping the gun and raising a property tax where the cash isn't even going to be necessary until February. So, I mean, this is an example, Mr. Speaker, of how from a budgetary perspective, we can use budget policy to kind of force executive branch actions. With these collection stories that have been coming out that are just atrocious, and you've also agreed at how atrocious they are, this is an example of how we can use legislative budgetary policy to compel the next administration to do what the current administration is not doing. So I just wanted to put that on the table, Mr. Speaker, because if we do come into this budget with that kind of a mindset, we may not need to immediately put a real property tax increase on the table because the cash for that wouldn't be available until February anyway. So those are just things that I would like for the body to consider before we lock ourselves into a full 12-month fiscal year commitment. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. And I understand that, and we also understood that the collection wasn't going to start until February. But we wanted to make that available, and whoever is doing the cash management between October the 1st and January the 3rd will have to manage with the cash that they have, and only 1/4 of that, 25% of that, and they're going to have to do some cash management. And then after that, with the collection coming in, give whoever's coming in January the ability to move forward at that point. I understand your point, though.
And if I may just make one more, Mr. Speaker. With the tax amnesty and the $30 million plus that's bringing in, based on the law, that money should have gone into the Supplemental Appropriations Reserve Fund, the SAR fund. And from there, that should have been appropriated by this body. That money never went into the SAR fund. And the reason why that's important is because if we're going to be doing a budget based on tracking and based on what's out there and based on collections that we're hoping to be able to go after, we could put the SAR fund as a line item in the budget and hold an administration, the next administration, to filling that SAR fund based on what we put in there. So for example, if we can reasonably assume that $10 million in prior year receivables is going to be hitting that SAR fund, we can add $10 million to the SAR fund and help that to balance things out. That will compel collections, Mr. Speaker, because right now, collections are just very random, and when the money comes in, it's not being subject to appropriation the way the law requires it to be. It's being used to pay for things. And the reality is that if this budget that we adopted in April, with the 1% increase, was supposed to be enough to bring the government whole, inclusive of a $30 million fiscal realignment, then that $30 million in amnesty shouldn't have been spent because everything should have been fully funded. So that's another item, Mr. Speaker, that I want to put on the table, is perhaps now the time has come for us to include the SAR fund as a budget category and appropriate from that so that we can compel administrations to collect the money that's outstanding. We've heard reports that it's upward from $150 to $200 million already. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Senator. I wish that we could get them to put things in where it's supposed to get to. But then you would have 1,400 people complaining today that they didn't get their tax refund today because they didn't have that additional cash. And so it's, I know we've gone through this with the, it's just, if I were, unfortunately, I'm just the chairman of this committee, but I've tried.
Mr. Speaker, you also actually just reminded me of one final point, and that is the provision for tax refunds. In our budget, we provision for tax refunds at $125 million. The whole point of that provision isn't for the government to actually set that aside. It's to create a formula basis by which money is supposed to come in and go into the income tax refund efficient payment trust account. That never happens. And so perhaps we should even raise the question as to whether or not we should be lessing out that $125 million up front as we do, or should we instead be just minusing out the actual funding source of tax refunds, which really is Section 30 money. So just a lot of different budget items in play. Things are moving, but there's several things that are just becoming very, very apparent. And one of them, as you said, Mr. Speaker, rightfully, is tax refunds. This $125 million provision isn't even followed. So it's something that we might want to also reconsider in terms of how we're going to compel the government to pay refunds, Because if it was followed, refunds would be paid faster. Ultimately, everyone just waits up until the court deadline. They take whatever loose change is floating around in the government and they start doling out payments as much as they can. But it's nothing compared to what is supposed to be happening based on how we're budgeting right now. So that's something else that we might want to reconsider, Mr.
I don't think there is any member of this legislature except for you that has tried more times and in more ingenious ways, including holding up confirmations to get, but you understand and you realize how, I hate to use the word futile it is with this administration to get them to comply, but you've made a more valiant effort than anybody else has in trying to force this issue and not been able to. If someone has an idea on how to be able to do that, hopefully the next administration will understand what that means and will finally set aside the 26% every collection month so that it's there. But you've tried more times than I have on that one, and that bus has backed up on us a couple of times on that one. Madam Vice Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, as to that point, there was a bill that I introduced that I think is still pending in a committee that would change the deposit to be a ministerial duty of the Department of Administration, I think. And I think that is something viable that would be able to allow the, hopefully, Attorney General that comes in to bring those people to court who do not make those deposits. And I think that's an effort that we should seriously look at. But I was going to speak on, I just want to, he brought up the point, my colleague brought up the point about the municipal leases, about especially DOEs for their office building and warehouses. And that was one of the that was one of the items we talked about in the last budget session. It was one of the items we talked about when we were having those FRP sessions. And it was one of the promises that DOE, I thought, made at the time as to where cuts were going to be made. And so I guess I want to just get some assurance from your committee that when they say they're operating under the FRP, the reduced revenues, and that agencies were reduced in their ability to spend. Obviously, DOE moved into the building, so I want to know what happened to those promises, and because that was the first line of promises by DOE, not the second. And so are we still holding them all to that spending level under the FRP? And are those built into our budget? Because I also heard you say something about DOE. So what is our expectations, particularly with DOE? Are they held to that first FRP spending level? Or have you raised that? And because that was how they were going to meet, I thought, that first spending level. Wasn't that the case? In their response to the BBMR circular, they included cutting the amounts from that lease.
No, I've tried. When the idea first came up of building the administration and including them in this lease, I thought I had embarrassed the GDOE administration about why would you build a man cave before you fix the children's bedrooms. And I would have thought that that was going to be sufficient, but they still moved forward and kept moving forward. And despite all of my efforts to try to ask to breach the contract, writing to the Attorney General to say, they haven't complied. And it's been 3 or 4 years now. And they won't bring that action. And I just don't know how else to be able to force that issue. We can talk about it, and later on when we get to it, you can bring them in here and try again. But it's not for want of action. because I can provide you with all the copies of the letters that I've written to everyone about how embarrassing it is to do that, what a low priority I thought it ought to be, why it should be considered a breach, and they won't do anything.
No, and I agree with all your efforts, Mr. Speaker, and those of all my colleagues and previous senators. However, when they came in here and we were discussing the FRP, the reductions we had to make a few months ago, that was one of the reductions that were promised. And so I want to know, it doesn't look like we're holding them to a reduction of the $30 million from FY18 if we are, if that's not reflected anywhere.
I thought when we went through this budget, we wanted to make sure that GDOE was not cut. I thought that was the top priority. So in both this budget and in the substitute of 237, I tried to spare GDOE, University, and GCC the cuts that were proposed by the administration. And I didn't think that we wanted to hold them to that 30% because...
Well, there were two levels, remember? There was the first round, right? And I thought everyone was being held to that. And that's how you came with your $30 million built-in cuts from FY18.
And
that was in the first
when we get close to that, I'll allow a request to have them brought in, and maybe and even entertain a motion from some of you to make that as a condition and put that into the provisions in the administrative provisions or in the miscellaneous section.
All right, then can I just ask, did OFB calculate the $30 million from cuts from FY18 Public Law 34-42? They were supposed to reduce their expenditures by $30 million. Is that correct? Is that right?
Not GDOE itself.
Well, but the overall, correct.
Overall, yes.
So where did OFB put those, if not based on the responses that we received in the responses to the circulars? Those were put in concretely in other places then?
Yeah, so the spending levels for the agencies were not based on last year's, so we're not going down from their spending level. We went from 0 up, so we built it based on the FTEs that were requested. And so when you come from zero, when you come from the ground up, we're not basing it off of what we reduced from. We're meeting it. We're creating it from just building it, putting personnel costs first, contractual, and so forth. And what you come up with, then you can compare it. But we didn't reduce it from last year's numbers, so we built it from the ground up. So whatever the reduction is, you're just comparing what we came up with in terms of the spending level to the FRP number, whatever it could be. But it's the appropriation levels for each of the agencies were nearly all executive branch, DOE, and so forth were related to what they requested in terms of warm bodies and what their spend rates were, at least for DOE from prior years. So it's the appropriation levels for each agency they're well documented in the budget narrative. But in terms of how did we get from FY18 appropriation level less FRP, we didn't reduce it from that. We built it from the ground up.
All right, I appreciate your answer. But then I guess the way I interpret that is that then we have not held any of those agencies who came in and said, we could make these cuts, these are reasonable for us. We're not technically holding them to that. We're just going to kind of restructure all of that and spread it around more.
Yeah, for DOE at least, if you compare after we create the appropriation level, if you compare that to the FRP level, it's a bit less because the retirement contribution rate was reduced, so there's less of a need for that. But it's if you do a comparison, I know that we had provided a comparison of FRP versus, the appropriation level, and so for the most part, there's been, if you wanted to do the comparison, there's been a reduction for many of the agencies. And just to clarify, I think related to DOE's leases, I think they had revenue enhancement ideas rather than cutting the leases. They wanted authorization to, I think, lease out some of their warehouses and then maybe sublease parts of their central office facility, which... Yeah.
Right, that was their proposal, that instead of us paying that for them, that we could lease that out to somebody else and bring in money instead of paying it out, but that's not been the case.
Yeah, I believe the Tizen lease for the central office does not allow for subleasing in the lease agreement.
Is that, because we had asked over and over and no one gave us any response on that.
Yeah, my understanding with the lease, it doesn't include
Is
the authorization.
that from, like you have an opinion or something on that? No.
There's just a section of the lease that says
All right.
it's not authorized.
What about on the compact impact, do you have where that money was, a list of where that money was spent in FY18 so that we could, and have you built in any assumptions that that would be spent again in the same areas when you allocate it in this budget?
As I understand it, the governor has changed the half that he has not committed for the municipal leases for the schools. The recipients of that largesse is different every year. Sometimes it's DOC to pay for something, sometimes it's DOE, sometimes it's the hospital. It's been at his discretion. If anybody wants to try to address that, I'd welcome it. I mean, I was just reminded, and they brought it to me. It was 2 years ago, in June of 16, that I wrote to the AG asking whether or not the Tizen lease could be breached, so that because of the non-compliance. And in the same way with you, as many questions that are asked, they just don't. Sometimes they just don't respond, and I just don't know what to do. I mean, it's just so frustrating. The only one that's been successful is to hold on to their confirmation, but unfortunately these are elected and we don't have can hold on to their confirmation, but that's the only way that we've been able to force them to make the payments to the into the tax fund, and then just only for that month. And then after that, we've been shined on, as it were. Won't use a different word, but.
My final question, Mr. Speaker, then is when we were promised reductions in spending in the amount of 30 million, and then the amnesty money came in, what is your view of the spending? Is it tracking now above the 30 million in cuts? I mean, are they spending the amnesty in addition to? I guess, are they cutting less? Is the question. Or are they holding the line on the cuts that they promised?
In looking at the CRER and expenditures, most of the cuts are still shown that they haven't spent the 3 quarters that it should have been at. I can't say that. It would seem to me that most of it is on these tax refunds, actually. That's the only thing that I can see actually being moved on a little faster. Rather than waiting for Section 30 at the end of this month, they're moving tax refund checks out.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Yes.
Thank you for your patience, Mr. Speaker. I just want to bring up a point in the bill before we completely address it, but it already has a stipulation for real property tax increase, and I believe this is the This is the bill that you proposed that we haven't really had a chance to open it up and dissect. And so, yeah, I just, perhaps, so is this bill anticipated to contribute to the revenues that are projected?
Correct.
Okay.
And it's in there, and there can be a motion to
Remove
delete.
it? Okay.
Yes. And in every single section.
Okay.
Okay?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recess for lunch. Mr. Speaker, it's 12 o'clock. Maybe we recess before we get into the bill.
If we can just at least get the title and the section 1 done, and then we'll come back and I'm sure there's going to be a motion to remove BPT, and there'll be a discussion on that. I just want to just at least get started on this so that we can. All right, so why don't we just go through on the title in section 1? Is there any objection to that, so we can start it? No objection? All right, fine. Section 1 is adopted. We'll begin with section 2 at 2 o'clock, since I know that there's going to be some discussion on that.